Hey everybody, welcome back to the Lila Rose Show. Snow White is in theaters right now, and it's not doing so well compared to a lot of other live-action Disney remakes of the classic cartoons that they made in the last century, in the 20th century. A lot of people are saying that Disney's live-action Snow White remake actually got a lot of the beautiful classic elements of the fairy tale wrong. It tried to basically make it more modernized. Instead of Snow White finding the prince, it was about Snow White finding independence or finding herself as a leader. We're going to discuss all of this with Jonathan Pageau, who is actually the author of his own rendition of Snow White. And I love this conversation with Jonathan because we're discussing some of the archetypes and the themes that you can find in classic fairy tales. He also discusses why fairy tales are important, why those original beautiful classic movies from Disney resonated so powerfully with many people, and why perhaps people are upset about the current live action remake of Snow White. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Jonathan Pageau is joining me now. He's an artist, a stone carver, an author, and really an amazing host, telling the stories of archetypes through artistic expression. And there's no better person to talk about fairy tales and archetypes because he is actually the author, as well as working with illustrators of some really beautiful works, reimagining. He might actually take issue with the word reimagining because it's not changing the original core of the fairy tale, but ultimately a retelling of Grimm's fairy tales. So thank you so much, Jonathan, for joining the podcast.
It was great to be here.
It's I admire your work. I see it, I've been seeing it from a distance. So really grateful for the opportunity to talk with you. I would love to hear just a little bit for our listeners who haven't maybe met you before, a little bit of your background.
And so I am, you could say, an artist mostly. I studied traditional Christian art. I was making art for churches. But I also always felt like that beautiful language that was developed, within the last few thousand years, that it has something more to say, that it in some ways can be a lens through which we look at the world. And so since then, since for the last few years, I've been trying to apply it also to different things to help people show how rich of a language it is. And so we've been retelling these fairy tales. We did one called Snow White and the Widow Queen. We also have done one called Jack and the Fallen Giants. We have 8 or maybe up to 10 that we're kind of in the process of making, in some ways using the power of the language, artistic language that's been used in the past few thousand years, and fusing that with the language of a narrative that has been maintained in these powerful fairy tales, and trying to represent them in a celebratory way is the best way of understanding it. We're not like just copy paste from the retellings that have existed before, but we're trying to retell them with a sense of celebration, a sense of mystery, a sense of exploring the deeper meanings that are in the stories, rather than the kind of cynical, political, and ideological take that we've seen in movies now for the past few decades.
Yes, and we are going to get into that because obviously Snow White has been in theaters the last couple of weeks. Your retelling in Snow White and the Widow Queen is absolutely gorgeous. I mean, the art is beautiful. The retelling is very lovely. So I'm excited to hear about that. But I'd love to hear your take first on this idea of the fairy tale. Many people have heard of Grimm's fairy tales. I think they first published in 1812. And the Snow White was one of those, among the collection, one of the tales that were told. But this idea of fables, fairy tales, it goes, precedes the Brothers Grimm. I'd love to kind of just hear a little bit of a background, even on the idea of a fairy tale and why fairy tales are so important.
Yeah, it's important to understand that the fairy tales were collected by the Grimm brothers, and then they were edited to some extent and published, but they are in some ways a written version of traditions that spawned before the dawn of time, before we have memory of them. And so there are versions of the Snow White story, all over Europe, and possibly connected to stories from all over the world that are bubbling up, you could say, from the dark past, the deep past of storytelling. And a way of understanding how powerful storytelling in fairy tales is, and folk tales, is to think about it almost as if there's a competition between stories. So imagine like old ladies telling stories, and then which stories do people care for? Which stories do people remember? And then which stories do people transmit? So you can think of a young girl hearing the story, a Snow White version, and just being entranced by it, and then telling it to her own children, maybe refining it a little bit. And then through the process of hundreds, maybe thousands of years, these stories become like precious gems, and they are representations of human attention. They are actual representations of what it is that humans care about, just because they've been repeated and remembered and repeated and remembered and refined. And so even if we don't understand the fairy tales, if we can't get to the bottom of them, we know that they are these representations of what people find important by the simple fact of their being remembered for so long.
Well, I think it's such an important point to consider that the whole idea of a story, especially for a young person and any person who's developing their view of themselves, the world, other people, God, it helps them understand how to think about those things. I mean, the story is this kind of this sort of blueprint almost for how maybe they might live their life or how they might encounter other people living their lives. And so when you're telling the, good stories, true stories, beautiful stories to children or to yourself in general, it's like you're forming your own mind for how to show up to God or how to see, your fellow man, your fellow human creature. And I think that's something that maybe we don't consider enough. And that's why it matters when Hollywood or, the kind of postmodern era takes these classic stories and twists them and tries to basically provide a different moral lesson than the maybe a traditional moral lesson. What's your kind of take on the importance of storytelling and what it does to impact the human psyche and human behavior?
Yeah, the way that I like to think about stories is that they're in some ways a kind of tuning fork or a kind of tuning mechanism. They're also a way for people together to recognize something in common so that they attune themselves together towards similar images, right? So they have the same reference points, they have the same relationships of characters, you could say, that are in the stories. And fairy tales in some ways are you could say they're the closest thing to scripture that aren't scripture. I'm not saying they're the same as scripture. Obviously, they're not at the same level, but they are very close to scripture. And they also, because they offer often images that are somewhat fantastical, they're less dangerous than normal stories, right? And so they're accessible often to children more because let's say the relationships in the story, sometimes that are traumatic, especially in fairy tales, there are traumatic relationships that happen in fairy tales. But because they're coded in princesses, in magic, and the kind of, incredible things, the child can assimilate the structure without being traumatized themselves. And what that does is it's like almost like a trauma preparation. It's not the only thing that fairy tales do, but one of the things that stories do is that they prepare the child for difficult things because they get to think about it and ponder it before these difficult things enter their life. And so they're extremely important, right? They are like kind of little trauma managing mechanism, but not just trauma, but also for positive things as well. Like, what's the purpose of your life? What it is that gives you meaning. And these stories, they kind of bring it together through images, the idea of finding the loved one, finding the prince or finding the princess, joining together, forming a family. These are things that make life continue. When people like Disney or these people twist the fairy tales away from those images, they're making them sterile, often explicitly. The idea that it's stupid for a little girl to want to find a prince, that is so insane. It's like, that's how people are made, folks. That's how the world continues. The idea that that's stupid and ridiculous is insane. It's like, no, actually, this is one of the deepest things you can do is encounter someone who is fair and just and joining yourself with that person. Like, how could that not be one of the most important things in your life? And so you see, when they twist it, they like you said, in some ways, what they're doing is they're taking away the strength of the fairy tale.
So what would you say are the biggest differences between your retelling of Snow White and the Evil Queen and the Snow White movie that is in theaters right now? Did you know that every year 200,000 families go bankrupt from medical bills, even with health insurance? For many people, insurance is simply not working for them. That's why I'm excited to share with you about Crowd Health, which is an alternative model for paying for your healthcare. Crowd Health takes your bills, personally negotiates them on your behalf, and then sends out a request to the community to help cover your bills. The Crowd Health community has fully funded more than 5,000 medical bills over the last 2 years. This includes accidents like a young woman in Tennessee who lost her fingers in a boating accident, to NICU babies and cancer cases. Keep in mind, Crowd Health is not the same thing as insurance, but it is an alternative model to help pay medical bills and keep your monthly costs low. So go to Join Crowd Health today. Use the code Lila at checkout to get your first 3 months for only $99. That's joincrowdhealth.com and use the code Lila at checkout to get your first 3 months for only $99. Joincrowdhealth.com.
One of the things that happens in the Snow White movie, it's very fascinating. I kind of had to see it because I've been talking about it now for a while. So I went to see it actually like on opening day. There's always snowing in the theater, by the way, which was fascinating. One of the things that happens in this version is that it's actually kind of hopeful. It's not a good movie. It's a very bad movie, but it's very hopeful because you can tell that they're trying to fix, they were trying to fix it. So there's a story which is a very horrible kind of political, ideological story that is there. And then on top of it, they tried to glue nostalgic elements from the first movie to kind of appease people, and make them. And what ends up happening is that all the signifiers become confused and the signifiers fall flat. What people don't realize is that fairy tales are deeply coherent, even though the images are kind of silly and ridiculous. Why is there a cat in boots? Why is there a fairy godmother? All these things, they look ridiculous on the surface, but behind that facade is actually a very, very deep coherence. So what happens in the Snow White movie now that they've made is that the images that are part of the story, the apple, the prince, the kiss, the dwarves, none of them mean anything anymore. They're just nostalgia bait. And then this weird political story that gets inserted into it, which is a kind of story of revolution and a princess coming into her own and, becoming the leader that she can be, that's kind of tagged on top, and none of it connects. So it ends up being all these threads that aren't able to be pulled together because they've ceased to understand the deep coherence of the story. So when we are trying to redo it, what we're trying to do is say, can we bring the deep coherence of the story to light in a way that connects, that will help people see it even more than what they saw it before, right? And that means sometimes pulling out a thread that, for example, helps you see the relevance connected to it, the modern world. Like a little example in our version that we've done is that there are two traditions about the mirror. One is that the mirror is on the wall, and the other is that the mirror is in the hand. And so we said, let's put the mirror in the hand. So you have this image of the queen holding the mirror out in front of her like a phone, looking at herself. And then the mirror is judging her and is telling her who's the most beautiful. And anybody with any sense, even if they don't think about it, will say like, oh, okay, like I see what's going on, And so it's like we're not changing the story at all. It's actually exactly the story, but just pulling on that thread a little to make it even more relevant so people can see what the story was about in the first place.
The thing you mentioned about the current Snow White movie having this this kind of revolutionary theme where it's like this kind of radical independence, autonomy, the ability to quote unquote lead, she's a leader, I think is the famous, now infamous, the actor Rachel Zegler saying, she doesn't fall in love with the prince, she's a leader. Leader's not bad, obviously, being helping direct people towards what is good, true, and beautiful. Like, theoretically, all of that is not a bad thing. Can you help us understand how you see the current Snow White, the movie that's in theaters right now? Because personally, I find it incoherent. I think they're, like you said, it's incoherent. Totally so they're throwing in these little like leader, autonomy, doesn't need prince, but they're actually also not saying that even in the movie. And so it's just kind of this gobbledygook of ideas that doesn't have a clear, like they did a bad job of their own revolutionary theme is my impression, but I'm curious yours.
No, of course they did a bad job because the problem is that it's like forcing, it's like forcing a round peg in a square hole. Like you can't, or is it the opposite? You can't fit. They don't fit. That's not what the story is about, right? You could find a story about leadership. You could find a story about, becoming the regent, like that. These stories are possible, and they exist in the story of the, like in different fairy tales, but that's not what Snow White is about. And so when you try to force that into the story, you end up with signifiers that don't point to anything, that become contradictory. Like a good example in the Snow White movie is they tried to do a wordplay on the sense of fair. And so in the original version, there's a kind of deep coherence between the idea of fairness as being beautiful and that outer beauty representing the inner beauty. right? And so that's how they use it in the original fairy tale and in the original Disney version as well. Now, in this version, they use the word fair to mean something like politically just,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's what they're using it as. And so that's what, and then at the end, the mirror says, well, Snow White is the fairest because she's fair in her heart. And it's like, then none of it makes any sense. Then why did the mirror say that the queen was the fairest? Because she's evil. I guess they were talking about her beauty then, but then when they talk about Snow White, they're talking about her being fair because she's politically astute. And then what does that have to do with the mirror? Because the mirror is about how you look. And so all the signifiers they just don't point to anything. Like, it doesn't make sense in terms of just the imagery that is used. And the same thing with the apple, right? In the original Disney version, they use the apple as this idea that she should take the apple to try to seduce the prince. And so what the witch is doing, what the queen is doing, is trying to say, you could be like me, like the queen. You could use beauty. You could use it to seduce the one you want. So here's this apple. Maybe you could bake a pie for your prince and you could seduce him. And so that's why it's a trick. That's why when she eats it, she dies, because she's now not, she's no longer the fairest, because she's acting like the queen. She's weaponizing beauty. But in this version, it's like she gives her the apple and she said, your apple used to give apples to people. And so it's like an image of fairness. So how is it a trick? And then if she eats the apple, why does she die? Like, none of it makes sense. It's just, like I said, it's just because they've ignored and they've become blind to the deep coherence of the original story.
Well, I think about this idea of sort of the warrior princess, right? And there are movies, Disney movies about the warrior princess, and there are amazing archetypes you could use of this warrior princess, you know, the leader princess, the one that is really sacrificing comfort and sort of the natural experience of being maybe a wife and a mother because she's going out to do something heroic on behalf of her people. You know, I think even about like the lore in our faith tradition. You know, I know you're Orthodox. You know, I'm Catholic, and just Christian tradition of the martyrs and the saints. There's all of these incredible stories. You know, Saint Joan of Arc as an example, who literally went off and left the sort of the Shire. She left the Shire. She's kind of like the Hobbit leaving the Shire, and she goes out to lead, men in war. She obviously is killed for her obedience to God, ultimately for her courage. So it's not like those stories don't exist. This is the part that's so sort of tragic about the whole Disney project right now, is that if they want to tell, the female warrior story and use that sort of approach, taking Snow White to do it, it just seems like, wildly, it's irresponsible as a business, because obviously it's not doing well in the theaters. People don't like it. It doesn't make sense. It's mixed messages, but it just seems like a waste too, because if they want to tell that story, they can. Is there a fairy tale where the woman is out as sort of a crusader or a warrior? Every once in a while, I find a small business that I fall absolutely in love with, and that's why I'm so excited to share We Heart Nutrition with you guys. WeHeartNutrition.com is a vitamin and supplement company that provides the highest quality, research-backed ingredients, customized and optimized to help you be healthy. What I also love about We Heart Nutrition is that this is a family-owned company, and they donate a full 10% back of all of their revenue to pregnancy resource centers to help moms and babies in need. So whether you are premenopausal or postmenopausal, whether you're looking to conceive, help improve your fertility, whether you're pregnant, and this is a great prenatal vitamin, or you're postnatal. Plus, I'm very excited to share this with my husband. Now We Heart Nutrition has come out with their first line of men's vitamins. And if you order today at WeHeartNutrition.com, get your vitamins, you can get 20% off using the code Lila. And if you spend at least $50, you will get a free signature bamboo capsule vitamin box. So go to WeHeartNutrition.com today, use the code Lila at checkout to get 20% off your purchase. And when you spend $50, get that adorable free bamboo capsule box to store your vitamins in. That's WeHeartNutrition.com. Is there a fairy tale where the woman is out as sort of a crusader or a warrior? I'm curious about that as an archetype.
Well, there are definitely different. There are definitely different kind of tropes in storytelling, and of the woman who hides her femininity, and out of sheer necessity will be forced to become a knight, for example. And so will be like a hidden knight. So we'll pretend to be a man, but usually there's some catastrophe that makes that necessary. And Joan of Arc is also, like you said, an image of that, where she is in her story, she's seen as being completely this exceptional thing that is so, you could say, that puts men to shame in some ways, because the men are not willing to defend the King of France, and she is so faithful to the King of France and ultimately faithful to God that she is willing to in some way sacrifice her femininity in order to do that. But it's almost seen as a sacrifice. It's very different. It's very different than the idea that she should be
It's a great
warrior.
distinction.
Like this weird idea that the only value in the world is becoming like a man. I mean, how is that good for women? It's like, so you're saying that women should become like men, and that's how you value women? That is insane. Like, that is not right. It's not like the story can't exist, but it does have to be shown more as a sacrifice than as this, like, all right, I'm going to show them that I'm the one, that I'm the, that I'm the and you see that, like, even in the stories of Regency, like, or the stories of or even of Queen Elizabeth, right? This idea that she says, that she will remain a virgin queen because she is forced in the situation where she has to rule, and so it's seen almost as like a monastic vow, where she is going to take up this masculine role, and is sacrificing her, even the idea of marriage, because of that. And so, like, these are powerful possible stories, but this type of, like, I'm going to be the badass, like, warrior, and I don't need a man, and I'm going to be the one. It's like that's just like, it's not real, and it's not interesting, and it's not like, who is it for?
It's not natural. I think what you're saying is it's not natural. Like, if, God forbid, there's a situation where there's no other man, or everyone's reneged on their duties, and God gives a special grace, and like a Joan of Arc, she stands up in the gap, right? But she shouldn't have had to do that, right? I think that's the necessary part of the story. It's not like in Joan of Arc's nature to go out and fight in battle. She did that out of love of God and obedience to God, but she shouldn't have had to do that, right? It was other people not doing.
And it's almost like I said,
right.
It's presented as a sacrifice and not as a self-glorification.
Yes.
Because that's what you see in this. In the Snow White movie, there's this whole trope in the movie where basically she's looking for the king, and she's hoping to find the king. And so, she thinks the king might be still alive, and there's this whole hope that the king will come back, and that we need to be faithful to the king. And at some point she realizes that, no, you actually, this is nonsense. Like, I have to become the regent. And then she says, to no longer be led, but to lead, or to lead and no longer be led. And that's the phrase. And it's like one of the catchphrases in one of the songs. Although none of the songs are very catchy, by the way. The songs are not very good. So, and so it's like, that's a very different thing than the idea that I am willing, because of a difficult situation, to sacrifice, my femininity in order to take up, like you said, a role in the gap, and to have a kind of heroism. But the heroism is a sacrificial heroism. It's not a, look at me, I'm the one.
That's such a good point. What is the storyline? I should have asked you maybe from the get-go, for those listening, and a lot of people are familiar, of course, but what are the core elements of the classic Snow White story that are essential, for, I think, informing the moral imagination of, the generations of children who have benefited from it?
Yeah, so I would say that you can do it in an extended or a contracted way. The first Disney movie did it very contracted, and I think that's a possible way. There are ones that are a little more extensive. So the idea, of course, is that the young girl becomes to the service of her stepmother, and that the father is no longer there. So she no longer has a kind of male counterpart, you could say. She's left alone to drift. She becomes a servant. She no longer has her. She doesn't look like a princess. She's a slave of this foreign power, of this woman who shouldn't be the queen. And then when she hits puberty, then all of a sudden the queen sees her as competition. And then the story of Snow White is in some ways Snow White becoming a woman and facing all the difficulties of that. And then ultimately understanding or coming into what the purpose of that transformation is. So it is a story of puberty. It's a story of transformation. It can be an image for any type of transformation. It's not just for girls, but it's very precious for girls, because, she's starting to become a woman, and then she becomes competition for the older woman. And then also she's cast out. She's kind of thrust out. she's faced with all these men that can't be her mate, that are kind of like idiosyncratic masculinity, these like little men that she can't marry. And there are all these like, they're, especially in the early Disney version, it's a good idea. It's like, what's annoying about men? It's like, grouchy, Doc, kind of dopey, all of these kind of idiosyncrasies of masculinity. And then she has to learn to work. So she's like cleaning and cooking, but who is it for? What is this for? Like none of it makes sense. It's like this being lost in the woods.
They were kind of really
and
quick.
then
They were kind of.
Sorry,
I
go
mean,
ahead.
my kind of impression of the first Disney make of this, which was a lovely, retelling, was that they were kind of like children. The seven dwarves, instead of being proper partners like a man who can lead her, they were effectively men who
Yeah.
were children, perpetually children, even in their physical size, most of them. And so that was
Yeah, you could think of it as like fragments of
but
masculinity,
childish,
like
that
little
weren't
elements that
developed,
aren't
underdeveloped. Yeah.
underdeveloped is a good, yeah,
Yep.
underdeveloped is a good way of thinking about it. And so they're literally named after the characteristic, and that characteristic totally dominates them in a way that they're not a balanced human, and it makes them kind of childish and fighting between themselves and everything. And so so that's in some ways the idea. And then there's a lot about beauty, obviously, in the story about Snow White, and what is it that makes you beautiful, and what is beauty for? And so in the Grimm version, what happens is the queen brings her these elements to enhance her beauty. So she brings her a corset, and then she brings her a comb, and they're poisoned. And then she ultimately brings her an apple, And you think, like, what's the relationship between this? And it does have to do with beauty, because Snow White is beautiful. She is the most beautiful. She doesn't need a comb and a corset. She doesn't need to augment her beauty. She doesn't need to supplement it. And as soon as she does that, in some ways, she might be weaponizing it in the way that the queen does. She's basically using beauty to attain something, right? She's seeing beauty as a tool that she can use. And that's what makes her die. You could think about it that way. And then ultimately, she becomes kind of knowledgeable of her own beauty, and that's why she falls. That's what the apple is. It really is like Adam and Eve in the garden. She's basically becoming aware of her beauty. She's becoming self-conscious, knowledge of beauty. Think about it that way. And that's what makes her die. But ultimately, the idea is that when the prince comes and wakes her, it's showing her what all of this was for, like what her transformation is for, what puberty is for, what like all of this annoying aspect of all these annoying like little undeveloped men. Like, what is this? What are these men? What are they for? Like, what's the point? And ultimately, what the point is to find the person that you can join with, and then that's the purpose of this. So it's a very powerful story of transformation. And if you play too much with any of those elements, and one of the powerful elements in the story too is that the queen sacrifices her beauty out of spite for Snow White. She's actually willing to destroy what she cares the most about just to stop. She becomes an ugly old hag just to stop Snow White from being the most beautiful. And so it's like that's a lesson for all of us for sure. But without those, then if you try to twist those too much, then you end up with something that.
What about
is
the
just
element
meaningless.
and the idea of the prince saving her, of rescue at the hands of a prince, or of a prince sort of fulfilling her? This is obviously very recurring in most fairy tales, and it goes both ways, because I think
Well,
about
that's what.
other fairy tales where it's the man searching for the bride, searching for the woman, can't find her. So one way or the other, whether the protagonist is the male or the female, they're looking for their mate.
Yeah, so you could think about the story starts with her losing her male counterpart, which is her father, right? And then growing up, and then having to find another male counterpart to kind of to make her whole, and that is completely normal. Like it's also it has a more, you could say, you could apply to all kinds of other things. You could see the male as something like the reason for the transformation. And so you could say that a girl that goes through puberty, like the reason for that transformation and all the difficulty that it brings is reproduction. Like that's what it is. It's to find someone and to be joined with them in marriage. Like that's actually the purpose of the change. And anybody who can't see that, and wants to transform, wants to turn sex into just a playground, into like all this stuff, like then what's the menstrual cycle for? Like what's all this stuff that women have to go through? It's like, no, it actually is pointing towards, the creation of a new family, of a new world. And so it's completely normal that the princess is saved by the prince. But like you said, there are other versions where it kind of goes the other way. When some ways, like the story of Beauty and the Beast, for example, where it is the woman who now saves the man who is out of control. She tames him in that way. Like she basically helps him focus his energy towards something meaningful instead of this wild kind of out of control energy. So it's not like the story of the prince saving the princess is the only story. There are other versions, but why would we get rid of that? It's a beautiful story, and it's important for people to understand that, like, in some ways, finding the person that we're going to join with is one of the great goals of our life.
I think there's this argument that the sort of modern retelling of these fairy tales, or I'll call it the postmodern, it's not even modern anymore, it's just the postmodern retelling of these fairy tales. I think sometimes it can be a little bit tempting because, this argument that, well, we've gotten it wrong historically on women. Look, we had slavery in the past. There was times when, we had child labor. The treatment of children wasn't so great. So to be enlightened is to test and challenge, most of what came before. What I find so fascinating, though, is the introduction of Christianity into the world, with our Lord coming into the world, the incarnation, and just how that cataclysmically impacted, of course, human history and our salvation, but it impacted human history. And the last 2,000 years of the the West and how the West has developed, how we understand Western civilization. So I guess what I'm trying to ask here is, do you think that our fairy tales in their best retelling today, do you think that they are ultimately Christianized, or do they predate the incarnation, but they still tap into eternal truths that were even understood before the incarnation? Or has Christianity had a special impact on our understanding of these archetypes? If you have little ones, you always want the best for them, including the products that you use for them. That's why I love EveryLife.com, because they have clean, premium products for my little ones. EveryLife diapers are also free from harsh chemicals, no synthetic fragrances, dyes, lotions, latex, parabens, phthalates, or elemental chlorine. Just clean, safe protection for your baby. And if you or someone you love is longing for a baby and facing the pain of waiting or infertility, you are not alone. My husband Joe and I, along with many others, are praying for miracles for you this year. Whether you're a customer or not of EveryLife diapers, you can go to everylife.com/pray to submit your prayer request. A huge shout out to EveryLife for not only making an amazing product that I love to use, but for this campaign to help pray for those waiting for their own miracles. Or has Christianity had a special impact on our understanding of these archetypes?
For sure, Christianity has had a huge impact on these stories, and not only an impact on the stories. If you don't like that, you could say even more in a more simple way. There are thousands of fairy tales, and in 1,500 years of Christianity in Europe, let's say, or more, then those that were remembered and retold and remembered and retold ultimately would start to refine themselves towards the image of Christianity, right? The story of Snow White is the story of it's a story of resurrection. The story of Snow White is the story of the bride and the groom meeting. It's the story of the heavenly Jerusalem. That's why in the Disney version, the first version, when the prince takes Snow White away, he doesn't bring her back to her castle. He brings her to like the castle in the sky. It's like the castle in the heavens. Even Disney clearly was trying to make it into a Christian version. But in itself, the eating of the apple and the embrace of the groom that awakens the bride, into union, it is an image of the church and Christ, and an image of the resurrection. So would you say then divine
revelation has we had some of these fairy tales and these archetypes certainly before the incarnation, in terms of the human timeline, but that the divine revelation certainly impacted the retelling of these tales and really almost perfected them. I mean, they're not perfect, but made them more perfect to actually lead us towards our own eternal destiny.
I think so. I think that that's probably right. And sometimes we have to be careful, because sometimes we don't understand it, because sometimes these stories, they're not actually as moral as we would like. There's something else going on in them, and we're afraid of them sometimes because they're not as moral as what we would like. But usually people who say that, it's because they don't remember what Bible stories are like, because actually
Mm,
Bible stories are not as moral as you would like. Bible stories are not morality lessons, and fairy tales are not morality lessons. They're more like tuning forks, or like world
interesting.
attuning mechanisms that help you kind of see the world through the right lens. Uh, and sometimes they don't always portray. Sometimes they portray evil too. Like sometimes they portray the consequence of evil. Sometimes they don't end well, and they're not all about, and and sometimes they just portray the consequences of certain behavior, kind of in a tight little story. And so I would say we shouldn't worry
Mm.
too much about it. The stories that have come down to us, especially the ones that have been kind of really maintained and remembered. Those are there's a reason why they're there, and it's worth it. And if you're going to tell stories to your kids, those are much better than the ones that are published in your bookstore right now, because the state of children's storytelling is
Mm.
crazy. Like, you can't think that because a book is in your kids' school library that it's fine. It is not fine. It could be, but not necessarily. So I think that kind of reawakening these ancient stories and finding ways to tell them beautifully, and with a kind of reverence and respect, I think that it is a way forward for culture, because we
Yeah,
can't
I think
keep
it's
going like
this
this for sure.
heavy-handed moralization. It's and they're trying to run away from, and you could say maybe a morality, but what they're doing, I mean, what this new Snow White is doing, it's like this in-your-face moralization. I mean, it's political, it's a politicization, but
Yeah.
it's a moralizing. It's a very overt moralizing, and that's what I see too in a lot of kids' books today. That we go to the library, we're very careful about what we pick out, but even like some well-intentioned books, it's like over the, like knock you over the head with this like
Mm,
not a Bible, usually it's like this modern retelling of something
yeah.
like this, how you're supposed to treat people. It's so overt and aggressive. And then you have all this politicization that gets pumped into it too. And it just makes the book so ugly, I think. Like a lot of kids' books today are ugly.
Yeah. And there is, and it's like Christians have
Mm.
been part of that, by the way. Like, there is a weird Puritan moment in fairy tales where the fairy tales, people tried to like clean them up, and tried to make them completely, fine, and give a nice moral at the end. But it's like
Mm.
those are not the most interesting, because the world is far more wily. The world has edges and is a little, the threads are not loosely as as tightly woven as you think. And so, for example, like a lot of the Puritans, were basically tried to say that these fairy tales have nothing to do with sex, and it's like, so then the moderns are like, it's all sex, it's all about sex, everything in the story. Bruno Bettelheim, writing his book about everything, is Oedipal complex. And just like anything in the world, it's like it is to some extent about sex, but it's not only about that. It's about all kinds of other things. And so we don't have to be crazy about it. Just tell the story. Like, there, you don't have to like cut out the parts. You don't have to. All of it is imagistic. You can tell the story, and usually the kids will be fine. And to the extent that it is about sexuality, like in Snow White, there is an aspect of Snow White that is about, like, here's one of the things that's, you're going to go through change. Things, you're going to go through this weird time that's going to be difficult, and you feel lost, and you're not going to be sure what's going on. But that's aiming towards something. Like, it's aiming towards something that you will, find someone, and that you will be able to found something new. And it's great. And that's fine. But you don't need to be
The
overly
end of the
moralizing about
Grimm's
it.
fairy tale, the Snow White fairy tale, is I think she's the mother, and this was not in the Disney version, as I recall, either of them, obviously. But the evil stepmother is forced to wear red hot shoes and dance until she dies
Dance.
by the prince. Like the prince,
Yeah.
makes his
Yeah.
wife, his now wife, I guess, her evil stepmother who tried to hurt her, he hurts her in this really torturous way, and then she has to dance and dies. How did you handle that in your book, Jonathan?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'm yeah.
Yeah, so this is actually, I mean, I think that this is a place where we can kind of hedge in some of the story, and that's okay too. That we have to be aware of how children are and aware about what in the world we live in. We don't live in a world like that anymore. We don't live in a world of massive corporal punishment. Like there's no point in some ways Christianity has also affected us. It continues to affect us. And so the way that I actually end the Snow White story in my version, what I've done is that I really lean into the fact that the queen sacrifices everything to basically to destroy her stepdaughter. And so she turns herself into a hag. And when she comes back to the castle, no one recognizes her. And so and she's saying, I'm the queen. And they're like, there's this crazy old lady. So they put her in a dungeon because she's destroyed herself and nobody even would have a way to recognize she's the queen. And then ultimately I have Snow White finding out she's in the dungeon and then basically forgiving her and letting her go. Like that's how I finished the story. So some people might say I'm being a little too soft here.
You're a Christian, you can't help
but
it.
I feel like
You're
this is actually I actually, this is Disney though that did this. Like Disney did in their live action Cinderella, they have a beautiful moment at the end of Cinderella where Cinderella forgives her stepmother and then leaves with the prince. Basically, it's like, I forgive you, but I'm off, right? And I thought it was very powerful because it was also, there was a dignity to basically her moving into a new life, but also she didn't want to hold the grudge and kind of. And so I thought that was a beautiful moment. And then what's going to happen in my version is that the evil queen is actually going to continue. And so she will appear in the other books and she'll have her own kind of arc. And so she becomes the witch in Rapunzel. And then slowly So I tried to find stories that actually could become symphonic. And so it's like the stories will all tell the actual story, but they'll be calling back to the older ones. And so as you move forward, you'll be like, okay, so what's the relationship between Sleeping Beauty falling asleep and Snow White? And then there'll be like a memory of the first fairy tale. So I'm trying to do this thing where I'm trying to help people see why these tropes are in the stories. That's for the adults. The kids will just read it and like it. It's not like I'm explaining anything. Don't worry. It's a fairy tale. It's less than 5,000 words. It's like, it's written really for kids, but I'm trying to also give, how in the recent fairy tale movies, like let's say Shrek and all of these types of stories, they have these kids reading and then an adult reading. But the adult reading is mostly just dirty jokes and it's really lame. So I thought, why can't we do kids reading and the adult reading is actually giving you insight about the story, how it connects to scripture, how it connects to other stories. I love that. Right. So that's what I'm hoping to do.
I love that. Beautiful. Are you hopeful that Disney, especially when they get, I think, publicly embarrassed by the way they pulled off Snow White this round, and they're hurting in the box office from what I understand compared to other films, do you think that they're going to, I think they have done some decent things in the past. It's not like, Walt Disney obviously was brilliant. Do you think they're going to find their way eventually?
Well, either they do or they die at this point, and in some ways, I think this movie, it gives me hope because it feels like the nadir. It feels like they realized midway while they were making the movie that they were heading for a massive disaster. And they spent an entire year trying to fix it and another $50 million. And so that's why the movie is so disjointed. It's so disjointed because they actually tried to fix it. It would have been much worse if the original version that they were filmed came out. Like, I think there would not have been a kiss. There wouldn't have been dwarves. None of the stuff that was in the original would have been there almost. It would have been Snow White. And so it's hopeful because it's showing that although they failed, they were scrambling to fix it. And so what I hope is that now there'll be a new kind of age of storytelling. But I think it's kind of happening. There's like a rumor mill going around the Hollywood that everybody's looking for like Bible adaptations. Like that's what everybody wants to make,
Joan of Arc. Actually Martin Scorsese is doing Joan of Arc. Have you seen that? The Saints. He's doing directing it.
He's not as postmodern as the others. Like I think
he's not as postmodern, exactly.
Yeah, he could maybe do it. Yeah, it's hard to do because even when you see those, often they're so bad, like because the take is so cynical. But we might see something different coming. I don't know if you've seen this Prime series called House of David, about the story of King David. And it's kind of on the nose. It's not amazing
It's
production,
trying to get there, yeah.
but it's trying to get there. And it's kind of, you can see things are moving in the right direction. So.
Well, you look at just the history of Christendom and the incredible stories, this worldwide spread of Christianity despite all the odds, and the incredible people, the martyrs, the saints, the virgin martyrs. You could do a ton of crazy, retellings of their stories. If you want to do like the female empowerment vibe, like what about the female empowerment woman who goes up and says, like, I will not, sleep with the emperor. Like I've given my life to Jesus Christ alone, like torture me to death, come at me. Like that's, those stories would be incredible, but we'll see where it goes. But I'm so grateful for you, Jonathan. I'm so grateful for your work. You're doing really, I hope Hollywood producers look at what you're doing and find inspiration. I'm sure if they're smart, they will. How can people find your work and buy your book, Snow White and the Evil Queen?
So people can go to thesymbolicworld.com, so The Symbolic World, and you just go on the store, you can find the book, or you can look it up just through Google, my name, Jonathan Pageau, and Snow White and the Widow Queen, and you'll also see the other books that we're doing, the other fairy tales that that have already been published and that are also coming. Amazing.
Next time you're out in California, you've got to come visit, and we'll do this in person.
Oh, definitely. Thank you for having me on. It's great.
Thank you, Jonathan. Great to talk with you.
All right. Bye-bye.